Welcome to the chosen ones. When the weapon is unable to strike the target, it turns on the person who fired it. They're now eating each other alive with the forks they sharpened for you. Let us get one thing straight. This isn't karma. This is a heavenly security clearance. Heaven has ridiculed you beyond belief, and it is driving your adversaries insane. They attempted everything, including rumor, sabotage, and backdoor spiritual warfare. But when none of it landed, they didn't back down. They turned on one another like a pack of famished animals trapped in the same cage. Here's the hilarious part. They're not only upset because you're untouchable. They're upset because they couldn't even scratch you collectively. Now they're staring at each other like, wait, who messed this up? Girl. Boy, you didn't make it through the narrative. You completely removed the script. Most people are unaware of this terrible fact. When someone has supernatural protection, those who attack them do not just fail. They self-destruct. That isn't superstition or spiritual architecture. Because God says, touch, not my anointed. That is not a nice lullaby. That is a warning shot. And others who disregarded it all are learning the hard way. The partnerships founded on your demise are now crumbling, leaking, and backstabbing their way to oblivion. So, why are they imploding? Why are they swirling now that you are standing? Stay around. Because at the end of this, you'll realize how heaven flipped the plot on its head and why your adversary's worst mistake was underestimating who was on your side. Let's get to it. Number 1. They confused divine restraint with unlimited season. They assumed your quiet showed you were weak. They thought that since you did not respond, retaliate, or expose them, you were an easy victim. They saw your tranquility as a green signal. But they didn't comprehend that heaven doesn't always reply with thunder. Sometimes heaven observes silently to see how far people would go when they believe God isn't watching. Oh, they traveled far. They planned with certainty. They lied about your name with ease. They moved as if your demise was certain. They were too brazen. But nothing landed. Every proposal went flat. Every trap they said fell under its own weight. They didn't know why it wasn't functioning. They began blaming each other. One believed the other didn't perform their role properly. Another individual began blaming someone else of revealing the idea. Suddenly, it wasn't about you. It was about determining who was to blame for the failure. They didn't realize God had already locked you off. You were not only protected, you were spiritually isolated, untouchable, inaccessible, and off-limits. Heaven imposed a constraint on your existence, like a heavenly do not disturb sign hanging over your head. No weapon devised against you could succeed. Not because they didn't aim correctly, but because the guns were rendered ineffective before they could be released. But here's a twist. They didn't see it. All they saw was their attempts crumbling, and their egos couldn't accept the fact that they couldn't reach you. They began clawing at one another. Accusations flew. Secrets have spilled. Loyalty collapsed. What was once a cohesive front against you has devolved into a battlefield of treachery. The people who grinned together while conspiring against you are now side-eyeing each other like adversaries. The fact is that you fought back and prevented the genuine collapse. It occurred because you did not. Your reluctance to play their game caused the attention to shift inwards. And beneath that holy glare, all the flaws in their union were revealed. They're not just falling apart. They're self-destructing. Everything began with a whisper from above. You cannot touch this one. Now they're confused, resentful, and turning on one another, still trying to figure out why you're still standing as their world burns. Number 2, the curse of an unfulfilled sacrifice. You were never just a person to them. You were the sacrifice, the one they wanted to bleed emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, and in some cases financially. Hurting you was not merely petty vengeance. It was their perverted sort of worship, a method to satisfy their egos, consolidate their rank, and demonstrate their dominance. In their eyes, you were the scapegoat, the repository for their unhealed wounds and concealed fears. They felt that if they could defeat you, they would feel strong again. However, there was one huge difficulty. Heaven refused to sanction the ritual. They surrounded you like vultures, expecting you to be the dead thing. But when they couldn't destroy you, they shifted their attention to each other. Someone has to bear the responsibility for the sacrifice not burning as intended. They were unprepared for divine intervention. They had their gossip prepared, their relationships solidified, and their tales practiced. But nothing worked. You were wrapped, anointed, and untouchable. That shook them. What really enraged them was not only their failure. It's that you didn't shatter the way they hoped you would. You continued to come up with your tranquility intact, your intellect keen, and your soul unshakable. That level of power humiliated them. They began to turn their heads inside, wondering who screwed it up, who didn't work hard enough, who spilled a plan, who started catching emotions, or who paused at the last minute when their strategy didn't go as planned. It caused a chain reaction. The blame game began. The group discussions became silent, and side talks began. It was more than simply dissatisfaction. It was wrath, the sort that has no idea where to go. So it begins attacking the closest available victim, each other. And slowly but surely, the same togetherness that had arrived after you started to collapse under its own falsehoods. Heaven did more than simply prevent their onslaught. It transformed their altar into a battleground. The fire they started to burn you eventually consumed their faith in each other. And now those who previously stood shoulder to shoulder in depravity are unable to face each other in the eyes. The sacrifice failed, as did the sacrifices. All because God said, "Not this one." Number 3, their friendship was founded on mutual animosity, not loyalty. The reality is, they were never really unified to begin with. They were not bound by loyalty, respect, or genuine love. They were bound together by a shared hate, and that was the only thing keeping them in the same room. They felt strong as long as they were fighting the same opponent. But when heaven refused to let them touch you, the glue dried up and everything crumbled without you as the objective. There was nothing to keep them from focusing on their own dysfunction. That was when the true fissures began to appear. They were so focused on monitoring you that they didn't know how fragile their so-called partnership was. It was not based on trust. It was based on bitterness. They were not teammates. They were traumatized, enraged, and anxious to destroy something greater than themselves. When God moved you out of the line of fire, they had no one to blame for their disaster. And as soon as their shared attention faded, the knives they were honing for you began twisting in wood. Now they're blaming each other for their failure. One believes the other was not dedicated enough. Someone else may have warned you in secret. Another person feels exploited and manipulated. The situation is chaotic. And it's all because the basis of their relationship was bogus from the start. People who band together to tear down others inevitably end up ripping themselves apart. That is the law. You are not only protected. Your protection exposed the flaws in their so-called togetherness. And there is the irony. They never had a chance. Not only did God protect you, but they were only ever powerful when they were up against someone else. They had no actual relationship, just a common objective based on envy and offense. When the mission failed, the mask slid off. They are now unable to trust one another. They now question every word, action, and purpose. And when they turn on one another, it becomes increasingly clear. They didn't truly like one another to begin with. They simply despised you more than their own reflection. And now that they are alone with themselves, the reality is eating them alive. Number 4, heaven has locked you in an unseen courtroom. They believed they were traveling in stealth. But the whole time, you were standing in a celestial trial, not as the accused, but as the heavens had already sealed. Your name, calling, reputation, and spiritual loss. You were not only favored. You were filed, documented, and seen by higher authorities. Everything they did to you was being recorded. Every deception, setup, and effort to undermine has been time-stamped and is awaiting judgment. You didn't realize it at the time, but as they were dragging your name through the dirt, attempting to drag you into turmoil, they were also dragging themselves into a trial that they couldn't win. They were confident they were in charge. They believed their chatter would be the ultimate decision. They expected public opinion to be the deciding factor. But none of them realized that heaven had already started the case file. And you were forbidden by edict. They breached more than simply personal boundaries. They crossed into spiritual and legal area. And as soon as they did so, the ramifications began. Not because you fought back, but because they penetrated the fence God had built around you. That hedge was not there only to protect you. It served as a warning. Please do not touch. Don't accuse. Do not provoke. However, they disregarded every warning. And now they're the ones on trial, turning against one another as the evidence mounts. Their oneness is shattered because they are aware that something larger than themselves is taking place. Secrets are slipping. Alliances are collapsing. People who formerly muttered about you are now gossiping about one another. They are all attempting to leave the same courthouse. They boldly drew you in. The concern isn't only over being caught. It's about recognizing that they were never in charge to begin with. Heaven didn't just protect you. They were legally exposed. And now the matter is emerging openly, slowly, and methodically, for divine justice does not need clamor. It just requires the truth. And the truth speaks for itself. Number 5. The assault was sanctioned by ego, not God. They were so certain they were right that ripping you down was imperative. In their minds, they constructed a whole case against you based on offense, envy, insecurity, and assumptions. They pumped each other up, rehearsed the falsehoods and replies, and moved as if everything would fall into place flawlessly. However, they did not care to verify whether heaven had allowed the hit. And heaven did not. They made a mistake there. Because in the spiritual arena, you can't simply come for someone God has designated and expect no consequences. Just because your ego is damaged does not imply that you have been assigned to attack. Just because you are outraged does not imply you have the right to damage. But they pretended to be judge, jury, and executioner when, in truth, they were only furious onlookers who became overconfident and took on a position that was not theirs. They didn't just behave without authorization. They acted against God's decision. And when you confront what heaven has already sealed, you are not just battling a person. You are resisting God's will. That's why everything began to collapse as soon as they launched their strategy. Not only slowly, but aggressively. Miscommunication began. Trust was broken. People who used to whisper behind your back are now whispering to one another. The strategy failed because it was based on ego rather than spiritual direction. This was not spiritual warfare. They made it a personal fight, and God does not support that. They were not correcting you. They projected their inadequacies onto you, and heaven saw through it all. So when they began moving, you didn't push back. God responded, not on my watch. Their alliances were not genuine. They were founded on fantasy. And when God's hand stopped the march, they couldn't accept that they were out of line. Instead of repenting, they turned on one another, searching for someone to blame for what went wrong. The reality is nothing went wrong. It was never going to be right since the assault was sanctioned by ego, not God. And heaven demolishes everything the ego constructs in the name of pride. Number 6, you were the mirror, and they couldn't break it. You did not need to fight back. You did not need to reveal them. You did not even had to raise your voice. Your simple presence caused a commotion. You walked in truth, which annoyed the devils. It wasn't because you were noisy. It was because you communicated clearly. And that clarity functioned like a mirror, reflecting everything they sought to conceal, even from themselves. They couldn't take the way your energy exposed them without saying anything. You did not call them out, but your presence made them feel that way. You did not accuse them. But next to your light, the shadows began to squirm, and instead of confronting their own mess, they turned on one another, eager to find someone to blame for why their manipulation failed. Why weren't their lies working? Why did their slander tactics keep breaking apart? You were not assaulting them. You were showing them just by being constant, being grounded, and not responding. And it was more than they could bear. They could not eliminate the reflection. So they attempted to smash the mirror. But you aren't just any mirror. You're a God-forged representation of everything they despise about the truth. When they couldn't break you or alter your image into something they could control, tensions amongst them began to rise. One accused the other for being too easy on you. Another began saying, you didn't do your part. The gang, which had previously moved as a unit, devolved into chaos since the strategy was failing and no one wanted to accept responsibility. Their egos couldn't accept the notion that your strength was not derived from pride or power. It originated from purity. That is why they couldn't touch it. That is why it did not crack. And now, instead of celebrating your defeat, they're choking on their own egos, trying to find out who failed, cracked, or backed out. But the reality is, none of them could dilute what heaven had already magnified. And now they're caught in their own filth, enraged that the mirror is still standing pristine, unblemished, and reflecting precisely what they've been fleeing from. Number 7. They imagined a storm, and God gave them umbrellas with holes. They believed they were smooth. I thought no one would find out. They spoke in dark places and dug passively. Their covert sabotage would remain well camouflaged. But they didn't comprehend that when you summon a storm against someone God has protected, it doesn't simply backfire. It boomerangs. And this is precisely what occurred. They banded together like spiritual arsonists, combining envy, deceit, and phony smiles like ingredients in a deadly stew. But God was already one step ahead. The exact thing they attempted to create for your destruction was jumbled at the source. Before it ever got off the ground, the concept was flawed. They felt they had control, but they were really going into a heavenly arrangement. Every secret they revealed to one another in those late-night gossip circles. It is now unraveling. And now for the crazy part. The exposure is not coming from outside sources. It is coming from inside the group. The same tongues that promised to be faithful are now faltering under pressure. The same hands that once stirred the pot are now pointing fingers. That's not a coincidence. That's divine intervention. God didn't just protect you. He humiliated them with precision. He let them congregate, allow them to stir, let them talk, because he knew exactly what would happen next. He gave them umbrellas with holes in them, posing as protection against the storm they had created. And as the spiritual rain began to pour, they were saturated in their own muck, appearing bewildered, deceived, and exposed. The power structure in their circle is disintegrating. One individual tries to detach oneself, while others claim they were never completely committed. They're all in survival mode since the storm they caused has transformed their safe haven into a combat zone. They didn't just lose the war. They are losing each other. And you aren't even in the thick of it. You're unharmed. You weren't meant to battle this storm. It would constantly collapse in on itself. Because when God mocks someone, even the most organized evil cannot withstand the consequences. And this one is breaking apart from the inside, one leak at a time. Number 8. You were their last test, and they all failed terribly. You weren't in their life by chance. You were sent as a test, not to chastise or provoke, but to expose. God sent you in their way to reveal what was genuinely in their hearts. It never mattered how they treated you on the surface. It was about how much your presence drew out of them. Will they choose integrity? Would they swallow their pride? Would they choose humility when confronted with someone who is favored or merely different from them? They did not. Rather than developing, they competed. They loathed rather than healed. Rather than pondering, they responded. You sparked everything they had not dealt with: insecurity, jealousy, control, and resentment. Instead of embracing the opportunity to mature, they chose to double down. They went completely serpentine. They gossiped. They manipulated. They strategized. As if it were a game. They were certain to win. But God never sends a test without setting a timer. And as the timer ran out, the test changed into a judgment. The same energy they used to hurt you became the weapon that destroyed their own life. Not immediately, but surgically. One by one, the mask began to slide. The job began falling through. The friendship began to collapse. The secrets began to flow. The peace they once feigned evolved into full-fledged paranoia. They failed because they assumed it was about you. But this was never about you. You were the mirror, the revealer, and the heavenly checkpoint. Their response to you informed heaven everything it needed to know. God was watching, not just what they did to your face, but how they acted when they believed no one would hold them responsible. The test findings were scathing. They're panicking right now. Not because they feel bad, but because the harm is beginning to manifest. Instead of accepting responsibility, they blame one another. You've gone too far. You began it. You made me believe them. The unity they previously had in attacking you has crumbled under the weight of spiritual failure. And God did not have to destroy them with fire. All he had to do was remove the grace, and their whole house of cards crumbled. Number 9. God created you radiation-proof in a room full of nuclear hearts. They were banking on your demise. They were counting on you to break down, lose control, snap, or at least shrink beneath the weight of all the quiet toxins they were unleashing. You know, the sort backhanded compliments, phony worries, strategic isolation, and falsehoods disguised as warnings. It was not always loud, but it was consistent. They continued pouring forth mental and spiritual radiation, as if they were attempting to taint your work. But they didn't realize that God had already made you immune. You were not just outwardly protected. You were inwardly fortified and protected from the inside out. What they expected to permeate into your soul never made it beyond your spirit. They expected you to fall apart. Instead, you stood firm, unfazed, unaffected. Not because you didn't feel it, but because heaven had already freed you from the need for their approval in the first place. This is what they missed. Radiation doesn't just evaporate into thin air. When you unleash hazardous energy into an environment where it cannot land, it does not vanish. It ricochets. They were unable to touch you. So the poison they prepared for you has turned inward. They're ill and have the same energy. They tried to infect you with worry, resentment, and tiredness. It is all devouring them right now. Slowly, relentlessly. They assumed you'd fade. Instead, you have just become brighter. And it's causing problems for them. Because they believe the strategy worked in principle. But in actuality, you prove that certain individuals are absolutely untouchable when heaven seals them on purpose. They're now trapped with the poison they've generated. And rather of seeing you melt, they are watching themselves crumble. Physical, mental, and spiritual. And here's the twist. God did not just stop the radiation. He redirected it. Everything they intended to hurt backfired with accuracy. It is not punishment. It's a consequence. And while they choke on what they let out, you're out here walking in clarity, shielded by grace, and gleaming like if you got out of the fire unscathed because you completed number 10. They invoked powers they didn't grasp. They were toying with fire. They had no business touching. They weren't just talking trash or gossiping behind closed doors. Some went deeper. They began experimenting with spiritual manipulation, energy, work frequencies, and rituals. They didn't quite grasp. They combined old language with current ignorance, all while attempting to tap into worlds they were unprepared for. The most dangerous thing was that they felt they have authority. They believed they could control the atmosphere. They believed their intentions were sufficient to alter reality. But spiritual law does not operate that way. There are laws, limits, and kingdoms. And when someone is covered by heaven, no amount of energy, incantation, or spiritual shortcut can defy the divine order. What they perceived as innocuous actions were in fact unlawful intrusions. When you mess with forces you don't comprehend, there is always a cost. They are obsessed with causing spiritual damage to you. We ended up opening doors they were unable to shut. They calmed down powers that didn't just refuse to follow them. They turned on them. The ceremonies flopped. The manifestations warped. The things they sought to create began to touch them instead. They didn't just lose access to you. They lost access to peace. They are now unable to sleep, correct? Their moods were heavy, and their energy were wrong. And they don't understand why. But heaven does. Because God was observing the whole time and never granted permission. So when they moved without authority, the retaliation was immediate but unseen. They are now anxious, skeptical, and shattered in spots. They are unable to explain where their oneness is gone. They are turning on each other, thinking that someone in the group has spoken too much, done too little, or fouled up the spell. But the fact is that the reaction did not originate from each other. It came from above. Heaven was in override mode from the start, and what they termed power was really rebellion masquerading as authority. And now they're perplexed, exhausted, and split. All because they ventured into territory they had no business entering. Attempting to coerce someone who has previously been designated as uncomfortable. A number. They weren't just jealous. They were consumed by obsession. This was not normal jealousy. It wasn't a transitory emotion or a side statement based of insecurity. This was a deeper preoccupation. You didn't just disturb them. You devoured them. Not because you tried, but because they couldn't understand how you kept rising, how you remained standing, how you continue to shine, when everything around you said you should have fallen. And that drove them insane. They were not preoccupied with your clothing, prosperity, or tranquility. They were preoccupied with their inability to dominate or influence you. You could not frighten me. You didn't flinch when they employed strategies that worked for everyone else. You did not give up when they sought to isolate you. You did not become the person they wanted you to be. And their resistance to their influence broke them more than they'll ever confess. Your name eventually became their second tongue. Every post, every move you made, every time your name was mentioned, you lived rent-free in their minds. They had to critique, deconstruct, and plot again. It was no longer envy. It was a spiritual preoccupation. You became their diversion, preoccupation, and silent rival in a race they started without your consent. The scary aspect is that their whole cohesiveness was based on pulling you down. Their friendship, devotion, and phony companionship. Everything centered around you, the dream of your collapse and the picture of your defeat. So when you continued rising, when your spirit didn't collapse and your name didn't shatter as they had planned, their relationship crumbled because it was never true in the first. You didn't just survive. You revealed their vulnerability. They were not strong together. They were only bonded by your ruin. When that didn't happen, they turned on each other, accusing and backbiting, one blaming the other for not working hard enough, messing up, secretly adoring you, or being sloppy. And now the fixation that once drove them is eating them. Because when your identity becomes someone else's demise, and that collapse never occurs, you're left with nothing but empty hands and a slew of shattered connections. Number of your preservation, was there a permission slip to self-destruct if their scheme failed? Something inside them cracked. Instead of stopping to contemplate, they went deeper. Rather of asking, why didn't this work? They humbly pointed fingers. Your survival, quiet, elevation, and sustained tranquility were more than simply annoying to them. It was embarrassing. And that shame developed into hatred, not just at you, but also at each other. Your preservation became evidence. They didn't want to admit that they were never as powerful as they thought, that their words were not law, that their alliances were weak, and that their tactics, manipulations, and emotional traps simply failed. Instead of digesting things with maturity, they chose to self-destruct. They could not understand that God had thwarted their attempts. They persuaded themselves that someone from inside the gang had damaged everything. They began accusing one another of being soft, of disclosing information. I secretly cheer for you. That paranoia became the spark. And all they had constructed on your demise began to crumble quickly. They were so focused on witnessing you fall that they neglected to defend themselves from collapse. You did not destroy them. Their own egos did. Every unsuccessful effort increased the strain on the lie. They convinced themselves you were beatable and that they had the authority. That if they simply worked more, strategized better, and pushed harder, they'd win. But you remained standing. And it shattered their delusion. They weren't prepared for your perseverance. And the longer you remained unaffected, the more their grasp on their own world weakened. They couldn't face the concept of you being spiritually protected, miraculously maintained, and still smiling. So they began doing the only thing shattered egos knew how to do. Find someone to blame. They are now at battle with one another. Their mutual disdain for you is no longer enough to keep them together. All of this began when God said no to their assaults and yes to your safety. You didn't just endure them. You unwittingly shattered a whole phony coalition. You were the signal for their own doom. A number. God let them create the trap so they might all fall in together. God could have stopped them at the first hint, falsehood, or subtle insult disguised as a jest. But he did not. Instead, he allowed them to construct. Allow them to plot. Allow them to dig the hole a bit deeper. Not because he wasn't observing, but because he was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something surgical. They assumed your quiet meant they had one. They mistook divine patience for consent. So they became brazen, began incorporating more people, added layers to the deception, rehearsed their phony care, and mastered their show. They believed they had you encircled, outnumbered, and finished. But they didn't comprehend that God wasn't ignoring their scheme. He was accumulating evidence. And when the time was perfect, he flipped the whole thing. The trap not only failed, but also collapsed on itself. The falsehoods that contradicted the group discussion began to surface. The false unity devolved into pandemonium. The framework they erected to bring you down was the same structure that exposed them. They were not just revealed separately. They were imprisoned together. They're now circling the disaster, blaming each other, seeking for the weak link, trying to find out who spoke, who swapped sides, and who ruined the plan. But the fact is that no one screwed it up. God reversed it because when he is prepared to protect his own, he does not just cancel the plan. He crushes it with lyrical precision. It was not simply about protecting you. It was about exposing them to one another. They can no longer trust the folks they conspired with. Everyone is a suspect. Everyone is nervous. The same trap that was meant to quiet you is now resonating with their arguments, paranoia, and unraveling tales. God did not only save you. He let the trap run its whole cycle so that when it fired, it ensnared every single hand that had helped create it. You did not escape the setup. Rather, you outlived it. They did not merely tumble into a mess. They fell into one another's falsehoods, which were buried under the dirt they attempted to cast on your name. And now they're left frightened in the dark, pointing fingers as you walk free. A number. You were never a target. You were the trigger. You were never an issue. You were the evidence. Proof that healing is possible, that peace exists, and that harmony with God is achieved by honesty rather than approbation. And for those who have spent years constructing their identities around masks, pride, and fake authority, your presence was too loud, even in stillness. They did not assault you because you had done anything wrong. They assaulted you because you disclosed all they did not want to confront just by being yourself and showing up authentically. They couldn't feign resilience. They couldn't imitate grace, and they couldn't purchase it. You were the trigger, not the target. And this is what caused them to lose control. You didn't have to say anything to convey serenity in the midst of commotion as you walked away. Instead of lashing out, the way you sparkled without seeking affirmation revealed them. It revealed the flaws in their character, the hollowness in their acclaim, and the insecurity behind their pride. They were comfy until you stepped in. They were comfortable pretending to be healthy and powerful. However, when you arrived with a genuine thing, the demons became agitated and projected because they were unable to process. They attacked because they were unable to absorb. Instead of asking themselves why your light made them uncomfortable, they attempted to turn it off. But they didn't realize that your light was more than simply your personality. It was divinely placed. You were put there to create exposure, not to be removed. They did not fail to break you. They were unable to break away from the challenge that your presence presented. And now they are faced with the reality. They attempted to dodge. They were not outraged by what you did. They were insulted when you reminded them of who they might have become if they had done the inner work. You were not picked to be loved. You were selected to awaken what is hidden in order to drive what is buried to come to the surface and stand strong as God uses your mere presence as a spotlight not to disgrace them, but to show them the tragedy of choosing to resist the light rather than learn from it. And this is why they are disintegrating. Not because of you, but because of the event you provoked. They didn't just lose the war. They lost the illusion. What began as a confident effort to bring you down culminated in supernatural revelation that none of them saw coming. Here's the most powerful portion. You never had to move a finger. You did not fight fire with fire. You let God handle it. And He didn't just protect you. He reworked the whole story in your advantage. They entered with ego. God answered strategically. They moved in the dark. God turned on all the lights in the room. They believed they were silencing you, but they were really increasing the sound of their own downfall. And through it all, you were protected, exalted, and kept. Not because you were flawless, but because you were in agreement. Heaven had its hold on you the whole time, which horrified them more than any comeback could. Your survival resulted in their unraveling. Your portion served as both their punishment and your protection. That was evidence that heaven's signature always cancels out health plans. So if you're still wondering what occurred and why they turned, why does it ache so much? It is because you were not just being assaulted. You were being disclosed, elevated, and reinforced. God utilized their scheme to reveal who you really are and who they really were. Allow them to spiral. Allow them to turn on each other. Let them attempt to make sense of the aftermath. Because the reality is, it is not your responsibility to bear. You were never intended to struggle for your name. You had already cleared it. And now, with the dust settled and the masks removed, you emerge not just triumphant, but altered. They're left to cope with the repercussions. You are embarking on a journey of clarity, elevation, and divine repair. The trap they designed to break you became the bridge God used to bless you. They turned against one another. You turned the page. If this message resonated with you and verified your deepest feelings, don't keep it to yourself. Go ahead and subscribe. This place, like the movie, was created to help more people discover the truth. Please leave a remark and tell me how it spoke to you. Most importantly, share it with someone who needs a reminder that spiritual protection exists and is unstoppable. This is not simply material, it's confirmation. And we're creating a community of individuals who refuse to lower their lights for the sake of others. Stay connected, covered, and selected. Your narrative is still developing, and it is getting better. God bless you.